Picture this. It's a Tuesday evening in late November, somewhere in the suburbs of Hamburg. A man named Klaus is standing in the middle of a brightly lit warehouse, holding a small piece of paper with a code printed on it. The code says, Aisle 23, Bin 14. He has been inside this building for nearly 2 hours. He came in for a single floor lamp. He is now pushing a flatbed cart that contains the floor lamp, yes, but also a set of glass storage jars he did not know he needed, a lamb's wool throw blanket, a packet of scented candles, a small potted plant in a white ceramic pot, a frying pan, and a stuffed plush carrot that his daughter pointed at near the checkout line. He has eaten meatballs. He has paid €1 for a soft-serve ice cream cone on the way out. And as he wheels his cart toward the parking lot under that distinctive yellow and blue logo, he is, and this is the strange part, genuinely happy. Klaus is not a fool. He has a master's degree in mechanical engineering. He drives a hard bargain at work. He is a careful, deliberate man with a careful, deliberate life. And yet he has just walked through one of the most precisely engineered psychological landscapes ever built by a single human being. A building that knew, before he ever set foot inside it, exactly how he would move, what he would touch, where he would slow down, and at what moment his resistance would soften. The man who designed that building grew up in a place called Småland, in the south of Sweden, on a thin strip of farmland surrounded by pine forests in shallow lakes. He was dyslexic. He saved string. He drove the same battered Volvo for 2 decades. He flew economy class until the very end of his life, and there are stories, credible stories, told by people who knew him, that he reused tea bags, collected salt and pepper packets from restaurants, and once, after giving a speech at a conference, slipped the unused biscuits from the speaker's tray into his coat pocket on the way out. His name was Ingvar Kamprad, and by the time he died, in 2018, the company he founded was opening a new store somewhere in the world roughly every 3 weeks, and the catalog he printed had become, at its peak, the second most distributed printed publication on Earth, surpassed only by the Bible. How does a man who reused tea bags build a fortune of $58,800,000,000? How does a Swedish farmer's son outthink the entire global furniture industry? And here is the question that matters most. How does the same man design a building that millions of people, every single day, willingly walk into, knowing they will spend more than they intended, and walk out of feeling somehow that they got a deal? The answer is not genius in the dramatic sense. The answer is something quieter and stranger, and a great deal more uncomfortable to look at directly. The answer is that Ingvar Kamprad, more thoroughly than perhaps any retailer in the 20th century, understood that effort is not the enemy of love. It is its precondition. Hold that idea for a moment, because the story begins long before any of this, long before the showroom, long before the flatpack, long before the meatball, on a small farm called Elmtaryd in the parish of Agunnaryd, in a region where the soil is thin and the winters are long, and the Lutheran inheritance teaches that thrift is not a virtue, but a baseline condition for survival. Ingvar was 5 years old when he started selling matches. He had noticed that the matchbooks at the village store cost more than the matchbooks his aunt brought back in bulk from Stockholm. So he asked his aunt to buy him a quantity of them, and then he walked from house to house in the surrounding farms and sold them, one by one, at a slight markup. He was 5. He was, even then, a wholesaler. By the time he was 11, he was selling Christmas decorations and pencils and seeds and ballpoint pens, ordering them from suppliers in Stockholm, marking them up and reselling them through the post. He kept meticulous accounts in a small notebook. The dyslexia made reading and writing difficult. Letters refused to sit still on the page, but numbers, oddly, behaved themselves. Numbers he could trust. In 1943, at the age of 17, he registered his small mail order business as a company. He took the first letters of his own name, Ingvar Kamprad, and added the first letters of the farm in the parish, Elmtaryd, Agunnaryd, IKEA, a company named after a map. And here at the very beginning, there is a shadow that this story has to look at honestly, because it is part of the man and not separate from him. As a teenager and a young man, Kamprad was drawn into the orbit of the Swedish far right, specifically the circle around a man named Per Engdahl, a fascist sympathizer whose movement persisted in the years during and after the war. Kamprad would later describe this period as the greatest mistake of his life. He apologized publicly, repeatedly, in his old age. He kept a friendship with Engdahl long enough that it cannot be dismissed as youthful confusion. It is part of the record. It does not erase what came after, and what came after does not erase it. Both are true. Through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, IKEA sold everything by mail order. Pens, picture frames, watches, nylons, and eventually furniture. Furniture was not the original plan. Furniture was the category that worked, and it worked so well that Kamprad's competitors, the established Swedish furniture cartels, became alarmed. They retaliated. They pressured the major Swedish furniture exhibitions to ban IKEA. They organized boycotts. They told suppliers, quietly and not so quietly, that anyone who sold to Kamprad would lose access to the established trade. By the late 1950s, IKEA was being slowly strangled by an industry that did not want a mail-order interloper undercutting its prices. Kamprad had two choices: surrender or look elsewhere. He looked elsewhere. And in 1961, he made a decision that almost no Western European businessman would have made at that moment. He crossed the Iron Curtain and started buying his furniture from suppliers in communist Poland. The price was roughly half what Swedish manufacturers charge. The political risk was enormous. The cartel collapsed. The boycott broke. And IKEA, which had been, until that moment, a clever Swedish mail-order company, became something larger. But the most important moment in the entire history of the company did not come from a strategic boardroom decision. It came from an accident, and from a young man named Gillis Lundgren, who worked as a draftsman in the catalog department. The story goes like this. Lundgren was photographing a table called Love It for the catalog. The shoot was finished. He needed to put the table in his car and take it back to the warehouse. The table did not fit. He stood there staring at it, and then, almost in frustration, he unscrewed the legs. The table fit. The legs went in beside it. He drove away. And somewhere on that drive, he had the thought that would eventually reorganize the global furniture industry. If the table fits in the car when it comes apart, why are we shipping it assembled in the first place? That single observation, recognized and seized upon by Kamprad, became the philosophical core of everything that followed. Ship it flat. Let the customer assemble it. Pass the savings along. The flatpack was not a marketing innovation, it was a covenant. The company would do less, the customer would do more, and in exchange the price would fall by a margin so wide that ordinary working families could suddenly afford furniture that, a generation earlier, would have been the privilege of the middle class. In 1958, Kamprad opened his first proper store in a town called Älmhult in his home region. It was a wooden building. It had a restaurant attached. The restaurant was not an afterthought. Kamprad had noticed something that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. Hungry shoppers leave. They check out early. They abbreviate their visit. Feed them, and they stay. Feed them cheaply, and they feel cared for. And so, from the very first store, there were meatballs. Hold that detail. The meatball is not a joke. The meatball is a thesis. At its peak, IKEA's restaurants served more than 1 billion meals a year, making the company, by some measures, one of the largest food service operators on the planet. A plate of 15 meatballs with cream sauce and lingonberries is sold for a price so low it loses money on every plate, and it is one of the most profitable decisions Kamprad ever made, because it extends the average store visit by nearly 45 minutes, and every additional minute inside the building correlates with a precision that would make a behavioral economist weep with additional spending. This is what Kamprad understood, and what most retailers, even today, do not. He did not design against the customer. He designed for the customer's behavior, the way it actually was, not the way a textbook said it should be. People wandered, so he built a one-way path through the showroom with arrows on the floor that channels the wander into a route. People got hungry, so he fed them. People got tired and overwhelmed by choice, so he placed sofas and chairs in the showroom and invited them to sit. People felt guilty about leaving empty-handed after spending 2 hours inside a store, so he placed an enormous warehouse of small, cheap, irresistible objects, candles, kitchen tongs, picture frames, paper napkins, in the very last section before checkout, where the guilt and the exhaustion and the desire for completion all converge into the impulse to grab something, anything, on the way out. The route through an IKEA store is not a layout. It is a story. It has chapters. It has plot twists. It has a deliberate beginning, middle, and end. It is, if you look at it carefully, a maze. A maze designed not to trap the customer, but to delight them, slowly, one room at a time, until they have walked on average more than 1.5 kilometers inside a single building and emerged at the other end, feeling not exhausted but accomplished. Now, before going any further, a small word. If stories like this one, stories about how an ordinary Saturday afternoon was engineered, decades in advance, by a Swedish farm boy with a notebook, are the kind of thing you find yourself thinking about long after the video ends, then you are in the right place. Subscribing to this channel is a small gesture, but it is the one that tells the algorithm that more people want to look at the wires behind the world. So if you are with us, leave the like, hit subscribe, and let's keep walking. Now back into the building, there is a phenomenon well documented by behavioral psychologists called the IKEA effect. The name is not a metaphor. It is the technical term. The IKEA effect describes the measurable tendency of people to place a higher subjective value on objects that they have, at least partially, built themselves. A bookshelf you assembled yourself feels more valuable to you than an identical bookshelf delivered fully assembled. A meal you cooked yourself tastes better than the same meal handed to you on a plate. The cake mix companies of the 1950s stumbled onto this when they discovered that adding the requirement of a single egg, making the housewife a participant in the baking, however minimally, dramatically increased sales. Kamprad did not invent this principle. He was almost certainly never aware of it in academic terms, but he intuited it completely and built an entire global empire on top of it. When you carry your flat brown box out of the warehouse, when you lay the pieces out on your living room floor, when you wrestle with the diagrams and the small bag of screws and the Allen key, that brief Allen key, that hexagonal little piece of bent metal that is, at this point, nearly a religious symbol. You are not being exploited. You are being initiated. You are being given the chance to become the co-author of the object. And by the time the bookshelf is standing, slightly crooked perhaps, the back panel slightly bowed, it is no longer simply a bookshelf. It is your bookshelf. You made it. You suffered for it. You will not, you cannot throw it away. The friction did not subtract from the love. The friction created the love. This is the secret that hides in plain sight in every IKEA store. Effort is not a cost. Effort is a bond. And once you see it, you start seeing it everywhere. The little yellow pencil at the entrance, the one with no eraser because erasers slow people down, is not a courtesy. It is an invitation to participate, to write down product codes, to become an active hunter rather than a passive shopper. The measuring tape at the doorway is the same. The shopping list, the catalog, the room set displays with the half-read book on the nightstand, and the wrinkled cushion on the sofa. Every detail asks the customer not to observe a finished world, but to imagine themselves inside it, to do some of the work, to bring something of themselves to the encounter. Kamprad called the catalog the most important publication in the company. At its peak in 2016, more than 200 million copies were printed in over 30 languages. He understood intuitively that the catalog was not advertising. It was the script. It was where the customer rehearsed, at home on the kitchen table, the room they were about to walk into next Saturday. There is a document that Kamprad wrote in 1976 called The Testament of a Furniture Dealer. It is short. It is, in places, almost embarrassing in its earnestness. A small Swedish manifesto about thrift, simplicity, and the moral duty to make beautiful things affordable for ordinary people. It declares that wasting resources is a deadly sin. It says in plain language that expensive solutions to any problem are usually a sign of mediocrity. It instructs employees to fly economy class, to share hotel rooms, to refuse luxury. It is the book of a Lutheran retailer who genuinely believed, in some part of himself, that he was doing God's work, democratizing design, fighting waste, lifting the conditions of the working family. And it sits uncomfortably alongside another fact. While Kamprad was writing about thrift and the moral duty to live simply, he was also constructing one of the most sophisticated tax avoidance structures in the history of European retail. The company was placed inside a Dutch foundation called Stichting Inca, which technically owned the operating retail business, and which was, on paper, a charitable foundation, though its charitable disbursements were, for decades, modest in proportion to its size. The brand and the intellectual property were placed in a separate entity, IKEA, which was for many years headquartered in Liechtenstein and later restructured through the Netherlands and Luxembourg. The result of this architecture was that IKEA paid, by the standards of European corporate taxation, remarkably little, and Kamprad himself moved to Switzerland in the 1970s, where he lived for over 4 decades, claiming Swiss residency for tax purposes, while continuing to brand himself, in interviews and catalogs and television specials, as the humble Swedish farmer who reused tea bags. Both things are true. The thrift was real. The tax structuring was real. The man held both, and he held them at the same time. There is more to look at, honestly. There were reports, surfaced in 2012, that some of IKEA's furniture in the 1980s had been manufactured by political prisoners in East Germany, work that the company itself, after an internal investigation, publicly acknowledged. There are persistent questions about the environmental footprint of a company that consumes, by its own published figures, roughly 1% of all the commercial wood harvested on Earth in a given year, while branding itself as a leader in sustainability. There are the working conditions in some parts of the supply chain, improved by the company's accounting, but never beyond scrutiny. None of this collapses the achievement. None of it is meant to. The story is more interesting when it is allowed to be complicated. A man can build something beautiful and necessary, and also do it through structures designed to keep his fortune permanently outside the reach of the country that made him. A company can democratize design for millions of working families, and also operate at a scale whose hidden costs are not yet fully accounted for. Both, at once. That is what an actual life looks like. Before we close this out, drop a comment somewhere below and tell me, what is the strangest thing you have ever bought at IKEA when you only walked in for one item? I want to hear it. There is always a story. Now, a final detail. Toward the end of his life, Kamprad gave the company away. Not in the sentimental sense, in the legal sense. The corporate structure he engineered, the foundations, the holding companies, the careful separation of brand and operations, was designed so that no single person, including Kamprad himself, technically owned IKEA anymore. He could not sell it. His children could not inherit it directly. It was, by design, ownerless. He did this because he understood something that very few founders ever fully internalize. Ownership, in the conventional sense, is also a vulnerability. A privately held company can be sold. A publicly traded one can be acquired. A family-held one will eventually fracture among heirs. By placing the company inside a structure that nobody could buy and nobody could break apart, he gave up the legal fact of ownership in exchange for something he wanted more: permanence. He bought, with the surrender of his name on the deed, the right for the thing he had built to outlive him by 100 years. It is the same principle, in a different form, that runs through every flatpack box. Give up the small thing, the assembled table, the legal title, to keep the larger thing. Let the customer screw in the legs themselves, and they will love the table forever. Let the foundation own the company, and the company will exist forever. Effort, surrender, participation, these are not subtractions from the value. They are how the value is made. Kamprad died in January of 2018 at the age of 91 in his home in Småland. He had returned to Sweden in his final years. The company he founded now operates more than 470 stores in over 60 countries. More than 900 million people walk through one of its buildings every year, a number larger than the entire population of Europe. Every 3 seconds, somewhere on the planet, another Billy bookcase is sold. 1 in every 10 Europeans, according to a figure the company itself enjoys repeating, is conceived in an IKEA bed. And so, in the end, the question is not really about Ingvar Kamprad. The question is about the building you walk into the next time you only need a desk lamp, and walk out 3 hours later with a stuffed plush carrot, 200 tea lights, and a story you will tell your friends for years. The question is whether you saw the maze, or whether the maze saw you first. The question is what we agree to every Saturday afternoon when we step inside a building that knows us better than we know ourselves, and walk back out into the parking lot, blinking in the sunlight, holding a yellow bag, and feeling, for reasons we cannot quite name, a little bit lighter than when we walked in. That is the design. That was the man. And the maze every Saturday is still open.